Welcome again. Let's kind of dive into it. So there's a bit to cover. That first session today was looking at sort of getting started with new quizzes. So we learned, I guess, that new quizzes is the recommended or de facto quizzes tool for automated quizzes in Canvas. We also learned that there's a classic quizzes interface. Maybe we've had a few questions over that. Really, the one to be supported by our team in the main is new quizzes because it's the one to become the de facto tool in the longer run. But it also provides you with a lot of functionality that you just don't get with that other tool. It's quite well documented. So if you go to the Canvas guides, instructor guides, you'll see quite a lot of info on every individual component, including different question types in here. So that's worth a look after the session if you have any specific questions. Also, get onto us at tell.team if you have questions specific to it, and it's covered as well under the 24/7 support by Canvas. So in that earlier session, we looked at the interface, we created a few MCQs and SAQs. We're going to just do a bit more today and just explore a few different question types. And we're also going to look at item banks and in a bit more detail. So there, where I suppose the power of automated questions or quizzes come into their own, really, in that you can draw from large banks of questions, multiple banks of questions, and randomize them, and randomize the order of them, and randomize the way that they're presented with answers as well. Um, we're going to look at the student view because that's maybe something you'd be interested in, just how it looks from a student's point of view. From when they click into the exam and they start to take it and what they're presented with. And also then we're going to look at a few of the sort of the settings at quiz level, including moderation, quiz analysis, and then a look at the speed grader as well. So if you missed the earlier session, that'll be posted up on our site, and I think there'll be an email going out about it as well. That's probably worth to check as well. Help I've talked about of the usual suspects, our site, and we're building on those guides as well. But I just want to take a closer look and just get into the tool right away. So in the earlier session, we built a quiz. And I'm just going to show you again, we can go into quizzes. That's where we author our quizzes and create them and manage them. I suppose one of the first points made is, if you're creating something in a live module, make sure it's unpublished. So you all probably know about the unpublishing and publishing at this stage, but I suppose it's particularly important in terms of a quiz. The other thing is, though, you also have availability. So at quiz level, for instance, with this one here, the availability period is from one date to another. Well, a particular date and time range there. 21st of April is just the sample there. But that means that the student, even if it's published, won't be able to access that quiz until then, if that makes sense. So it's kind of just released to them at that time. So there's a couple of things you can just ensure to make sure that that isn't released out to the students right away. Points we made in the earlier session as well, folks, is that it's a really good idea to run a couple of practice tests, or at least one with your students before doing the main stage event, because it'll just get them familiar with the tool, and that just literally only needs to be a few sample questions just to get them familiar with the interface. So in our quiz one example earlier, we looked at the importance of instructions and also just built a few sample question types. Now, this example here has a few item banks, and I'll just show you item banks in a minute, but you see the example here. So this has an item bank called Irish Constitution SAQs, and what I can do with that bank is I can pull a number of questions out of that bank. So if I just wanted to pull one question, that'll just pull one unique question out of that pool each time, well, insofar as is possible. The other question types we looked at in the last one was MCQ, but I just want to go through a couple of the other question types before we maybe dive into a bit on item banking and settings. So this blue button in the middle is for adding any items. We have quite a number of different other sort of question types in here. One of the nice ones here is hotspot. So if you have an image and you want someone to click on a particular part of that image, say it's a diagram or something, that's quite a useful interaction. So in hotspot, I can, as usual, this is just a sort of a title for myself. I'll just put in hotspot question. And here we're going to, I'm just going to find an image for myself a second. Just bear with me. Okay, so we can drag and drop. So I'm just going to drag something in here. And with this sample image, we can choose where we want that hotspot to be. This is quite a small image. It wouldn't be very, I'm sorry, actually, what I'll do is I'll bring in a larger version of that image just so that we can, yeah, so here's a better one. And so in this instance, we can say, right, the Canvas logo is in the middle here. We want that to be our hotspot. And then we have a couple of options associated with that. Probably not showing an on-screen calculator. That's just a default setting for all of the question types, but you can item bank it. And a hotspot is as simple as that. Now that works quite well, I think, for maybe diagrams or places where you want a student to click on a particular spot to identify something. And it's as simple as that, really. You just have the image source you can drag in or upload, and then you have the highlights. And once you're happy, you can just click on done. And we'll see how that looks from a student's point of view in a minute. We talked about SAQs already. The other types of question types, maybe true or false, are useful. And that's, again, quite straightforward. So we can say CIT is based in Cork. True or false? True. And again, we can have those standard item options in there as well. So that's quite straightforward. If you're looking to just indicate the true or false, you just click on the radio button for the relevant answer. So that's another question type in there. You also have fill in the blank. So this is quite a simple interaction as well. So we can say, I might just repeat that. Let's say, what CIT stand for. And we just simply highlight the blank that's required, and sorry, it shouldn't be CIT stand, it should be CIT, and that'll actually create a blank, and the student then enters that in. Now you have a number of options here in the blank insert blank question type. You have open entry, which is probably the most common. You've the different attributes then. Is it contains? Is it close enough? You know, there's a small margin of error allowed there. And you can also have options where there's a drop down. So you can have different possible choices in there. So a few useful options in there as well. And that's the fill in the blank option there. Just going to have an open entry for the moment. And as with all of them, you just have the standard options there, and you might give them different points values. The other question type worth looking at possibly is formula. So that allows you to create sort of equations and have variables, and also then have a sort of a margin of error going with whatever is inserted into the variables. I'm not going to create an equation there, but I can certainly give you some pointers or articles on creating equations. And if you want to reach out to us at Tell.team, we can give you a bit more guidance on that as well. But in the main, I think what people will be looking for are these kind of standard question types, where true or false, fill in the blank, images, SAQs, and MCQs. There are others, maybe that aren't maybe used as much. Ordering, for instance, is just where you can drag and drop the items into particular order. Matching as well. So we might leave those there. I want to get into item banking, so that we can kind of get an idea of that. So in this particular example, I can pull any of these questions that I've created into what are called item banks. So if I click on this one and click on the edit symbol, there is the option underneath to item for item banking. That allows me to add into an item bank either an existing one or a new one. Now I'll have all of my existing ones in here. These are ones that I've created, but there's also the ability then in the library to look at other item banks that are shared with you. I'll talk about that in a second. So I'm just going to add to an existing bank called Item Bank Test CIT and add it in there. And if I want to ever look at my bank, I can either scroll up to the top and click on Item Banks, or I can go to Edit in Bank. And once a question is in a bank, you can edit it within that bank, which is important. I suppose that makes sure that you don't have multiple versions working around the place from different item banks, if you get me. Um, and this is what it looks like inside an item bank. So you see all of your different options in there, the different item or create questions that I've created. But also, I suppose if you wanted to copy one of these out into another quiz and edit it and have a different version, you can do that by using this option here, copy or move item. And so that'll allow you to copy into another bank and to have a kind of a different version, if you get me. So that's if you want to kind of create a different version. Um, if I go back into my item banks up on top here, this link up on top, I'll just see all of the different item banks I have in there. And I have a few here that are shared with me from other modules. That's quite useful if you're sharing an item bank and want to collaborate over an item bank with other lectures. Those item banks are accessible, Anna, and all across any modules that you're enrolled on. So if you're creating item banks, those item banks will be available in any modules that you're enrolled on. But then if you want to share out with other people, you can do that. So with the item bank here, if I go to share, I can share with Dara, um, and that'll show up in his item bank so that he can actually go ahead and edit that with me and contribute to that with me as well. So that's quite useful, I think, for collaborating over your item banks. And again, item banks aren't just specific to one module, they're shared across any modules that you're enrolled in. So that's quite useful, I think, if you want to mix and match them. Where we've seen people using item banks quite effectively is where they maybe think of item banks as as question themes. So for our question types. So for example, I have one here called SAQs, and you might have another one called MCQs. You might have another one called different question types. The other option there is obviously to think thematically. So if you're dealing with, say, the with computer science or something like that, you might talk about different disciplines and have each of the disciplines have different item banks associated with them, so that you can mix and match them for a combined assessment later on. So quite a lot of options there available to you. You can edit, delete them from there. And I suppose the most powerful thing there is you can share them with others as well. Um, just going to go back here a second. I have a question from Sinead. Can you use fill in the blanks for a table? You can, of course, Sinead. Yeah. So that's something we can look at separately if you want to. But that's a useful option there as well for you. So I'm just going to go back up to, so we've covered maybe some of the item bank questions. I'll take some questions afterwards as well on specifics. We can do a few demonstrations for you. Um, the other thing I wanted to show you is the student view. So presuming we have our item banks set up and we've them entered in here, just an example, actually, I'll just bring in one of those banks in just to show you what that looks like here. Click on add content. And if I go to the item bank or the piggy bank icon here, I can actually bring in that item bank, my first item bank here. Uh, Actually this one, and click on the all or random button, and that brings in all questions from that particular item bank. So there's 7 questions in there. But more importantly, as I said at the start, you can click on the edit option and you can randomly select a number of questions out of that. So say I just want 2, and I've given the points for a question, that'll just pull out 2 questions out of that bank each time. So that's useful, I think. So you can imagine having a number of item banks and combining them all the way down an assessment to create a truly unique assessment for each student. So if I'm going to the student view of things, I want to just maybe come back out here and just show you what that looks like. So I know that I have a test student account here for myself. I'm going to just show you what that looks like from the get-go. So if I go into quizzes and I go to the quiz 1 option here, I can see the options from a student's point of view. So they see the quiz, they see the instructions, which we've said are quite important at the start in terms of maybe outlining the weighting or the duration and the marks going for the different question types. Also, the time limit, that's going to start a counter at the very beginning of the session. And I have a note saying that backtracking is disabled. We kind of covered that in the earlier session, but that just means students can't go back to a previous question. Um, so the access code, I think we set as TL 2020 for this. So that's successful. That allows me to begin as a student and I can go through the assessment then. So it takes a couple of minutes or a couple of seconds to load. And once it does load, then the student gets their unique assessment. So it gives a progress bar, shows them where they are. And in this, we can kind of just go through and answer. I think this is in this particular one, we have one question at the time, which again we've been advised by our friends in Access that that's a good way of going. It's a better way of going in terms of presenting the student with one question at the time rather than a series of them where they're scrolling. So let's just quickly go through this. I'm not going to answer some of the SAQs. We have a couple of options here in terms of fill in the blank. We can upload something in here if we want to. Let's just say I have JPEG. Next, I'm not sure what I put in there, so I'm just going to leave that. And then you have your hotspot example there, and click on the logo. And there's another one. There's a few repetitions here because I put in a few item banks that are the same, and so on and so on. Okay, so then the student, if you have it enabled, gets the results displayed to them based on what they've interacted with. And in this case, we have a few SAQs and we have a few MCQs and we have other question types. But anything that requires grading will give them this message saying there are questions that require grading, and that's where you come in when you're their answers in there as well. So quite accessible from their point of view. And once they're finished, they can return out of it, and that's that taken, that quiz, this exam taken. Just from a speed grader point of view, I just want to get into that quite quickly. If you go to grades and we go into the test student for that particular one, and if I go into the speed grader, I can actually view the quizzes inline here in the speed grader. So this is where you can actually have another level of feedback in on the quiz. So you can have I suppose obviously the ability to review the automated stuff. So that's the MCQs and those other ones, the fill in the blank and the hotspot. But for the SAQs, where your input is required, you can basically give them their mark and their feedback in here. So this is an example of an SAQ. What is Article 40 of the Irish Constitution? It says waiting for grade. Obviously, if their answer was there, it would be in here, but you would be able to give them a bit of feedback on that answer in there and also a mark. And then you can kind of commit that in, and that gets marked alongside everything else. And once you've finished giving the feedback and correcting those SAQs, obviously the overall mark will be available. And all of this, the usual rules apply then in terms of how that mark is released to the student, whether this assignment is uh, has a grade policy of hiding marks or if they're going out to them straight away. So I'd touch base with Dara maybe on his session later on that whole grade posting policy if you're interested in that. I suppose at this level as well, you can give them a bit of assessment level feedback. So you can add comments that apply to the whole assessment. And you can also attach anything relevant, like an audio comment or a video comment if you wanted to. And so there's a bit of leeway there in terms of giving them rich feedback on top of what they've actually performed. So I'd say whether you're going completely automated or whether you're going, semi-automated, where you have the likes of MCQs and stuff that are completely graded, and then the other types of questions like open answer questions or SAQs, it's good maybe to have that option to give them another bit of feedback here at this level as well, depending on how they interacted with the assessment. So I'm just going to X out of this a second. So if I go back to my grades, I can actually go back to the module and back into that quiz. I just want to go through a few of the quiz level settings as well. So in this particular quiz, I have a number of settings available up here on the top. And so these are where, you can shuffle questions and answers, which is really powerful. Again, you can shuffle the item banks and the way that they're presented, as well as, as you've seen, shuffle the content in those item banks as well. The one question at the time is where we were able to just present one question at a time, and the allow backtracking option there was obviously ticked. That's your access code. That's your time limit. And I suppose for the other stuff here, if we did want to restrict the student result view and not show the students the results, that we'd click on this, and anything that's unchecked would be hidden. Anything that's checked would be hidden. So that's obviously useful if you're running a summative exam and you don't want to give the students their result right away, especially if you have stuff to be graded. I wouldn't. I think I'd nearly have that unticked if you're doing practice quizzes. Again, one of the points at the start of the session there was, and in the last session, was that it's good to maybe give the students a chance to interact with one of these quizzes if you're going to use them for summative examinations. And so if you did a practice quiz with the students, it might be an idea to allow them to have multiple attempts so that they can go through it a number of times and that they get a chance to sort of interact with that. The other thing as well is obviously you could just hide that if you wanted to as well. Just up here in reports, if I go to my quiz and item analysis, this becomes really, really rich data when you have a lot of submissions into your assignment. So you get very sort of kind of blow by blow feedback on how students responded to particular items or questions, and basically how what sort of trends were there in terms of how they interacted with the quiz. What is also really powerful is if you go to the moderate feature here and you go in and view um, the different data attached to their attempts. So if I go into the student test, the Shane student test, and I go to the log here, again, I get a kind of a really detailed, granular sort of detail on the way the students kind of went through the whole exam. So you'll see the time spent, the browser, the operating system. And so, if there was any question of a student possibly dropping off in their internet connection or something, it'd be very obvious here. And there are accommodations then as well on that subject. If, say, for instance, you wanted to give a student more time, you could do so here using give additional time, remove time limit, etc. This also might be used in a case where you have students that um, need certain accommodations. Maybe they need extra time because of having some sort of a disability, etc. So that might be worth a look there. There's also a useful feature that Garrod announced today called the chat feature in Canvas. And the chat feature might also work nicely as a thing to complement something like a live MCQ. The reason I say that is, you might have a way for students to communicate with you if they're having difficulty through an exam, through one of these live MCQs. And there's no problem in a student being able to do that as well as conduct a live test. So that's maybe something you might want to test if you're interested in it. The other thing here is just this moderate feature on the right hand side allows you to reopen an attempt for a particular user. And also some of those time adjustments there that we saw in the accommodations feature there. Um, I'm conscious of a few queries in there. I think we've covered maybe the bones of the sort of the new quizzes tool, but I just want to answer maybe some specific questions in there. I'm just going to have a look here in the chat. So this is where I might, as usual, just stop the live stream on YouTube and just open it up to the floor there. We've quite a number of attendees. So maybe you have specific questions and we can run through them. So just thanks very much for viewing live there on YouTube, everyone.